So, speaking of the author, we're really excited to welcome Akemi Johnson today. She's the author of Night in the American Village, Women in the Shadow of the U.S. Military Bases in Okinawa. She's a former Fulbright scholar in Okinawa, and she has written about the island for The Nation, Travel and Leisure, Anthony Bourdain's Explore Parts Unknown, and other publications. She has also contributed to NPR's All Things Considered and Code Switch. A graduate of the Writers Workshop in Brown University, she lives in Northern California and works for the Fred T. Korematsu Institute, which educates to advance racial equity, social justice, and human rights for all. And then later, we're also going to be welcoming Lily Welty Tamai, who teaches at UCLA in the Asian American Studies Department. She earned her doctorate in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She conducted research in Japan and Okinawa as a Fulbright graduate research fellow and was also a Ford Foundation fellow. Her forthcoming book, titled Military-Industrial Intimacy, Mixed-Race American-Japanese Eugenics and Transnational Identities, documents the history of mixed-race American-Japanese and American Okinawans born after World War II and raised during the post-war period. Dr. Tamai was formerly the curator of history right here at the Japanese American National Museum and currently serves on the U.S. Census Bureau National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. So you're really in for a really wonderful program today, and please join me in welcoming Akemi Johnson.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for coming out today. It's really wonderful to see you here, and I'm really excited to be here at JANM. I've been a fan of this museum for a long time, and I really appreciate how they work to include multiple aspects of the Japanese American experience, including mixed race stories, and today Okinawa. I'm also really excited to be here with Lily. We were Fulbright scholars together in Okinawa, and we did some really hard-hitting research, like going undercover in nightclubs and interpretive dance karaoke. But really, she's an excellent scholar in Okinawa, and I'm excited to talk with her today. And then also hear from all of you, so I'd love to hear questions and comments from you later on. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from. So I'm from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and my father is white American, my mother is Japanese American, third generation Sansei, so I'm Yonsei. And my great-grandparents immigrated from the Hiroshima area to California in the early 1900s. I grew up in a part of the Bay Area that wasn't very diverse. So actually my hometown is currently the #1 whitest town in California. And so, when I was young, I didn't want to be Japanese. I wanted to be like everyone else. And I hated my Japanese first name, which no one could pronounce. And I didn't want to be associated with Japan, which was a place I really knew nothing about when I was growing up. I think in large part because of the World War II Japanese American incarceration, which my grandparents lived through. They really worked to assimilate into, white American culture and didn't really pass down Japanese culture to my mom and therefore not to me either. So, most of what I've learned about Japan has been acquired on my own. And that really started in college for me. And I think it's kind of a typical story. I think I've heard this a lot actually, that, when I got to college, I did this like 180 and I just dove into my Japanese identity, like all in. And I started studying Japanese. I majored in East Asian studies. I signed up to study abroad in Kyoto. And then, when I arrived in Kyoto, I think I had what's also a common experience is that, in the United States, I often describe myself as Japanese. So I say, I'm half Japanese, my name is Japanese. But in Japan, of course, people just saw me as American. And I found that, my name, which in the US nobody could pronounce, I actually couldn't pronounce it in Japan so that people could understand what I was saying. So that was kind of a difficult experience going to Japan. And during that time was the first time that I traveled to Okinawa for the first time. And right away I saw that this was a very different place than the rest of Japan, than the parts of the mainland Japan that I had been to. So I'm just curious who, if I can, it's hard to see you guys, but who here has been to Okinawa? Okay, so quite a few. Okay, so for those of you who might not know, I'm just going to do a quick kind of overview about Okinawa. So this is Okinawa. Here's a map of Japan. Right, and so Okinawa is way down here. It's its own chain of subtropical islands, and you can see it's just as close, if not closer, to Taiwan and China as it is to mainland Japan. So it's different from mainland Japan in many ways. There's that subtropical climate, so there's beautiful white sand beaches, blue water, vacation postcard scenery. It has its own distinct language and culture and history because it used to be an independent kingdom called the Ryukyu Kingdom, and it has a very heavy U.S. military presence. So you can see, looking at this map, right, in terms of geography, Okinawa is just a tiny part of Japan. I think it's less than 1%, but it hosts about half of the 54,000 American troops who are stationed in Japan, and 64% of the land used by American military bases in Japan is in Okinawa. Most of the bases are on the main island of Okinawa, so that's here. And you can see on this map how many bases there are and how much space they take up. This island has one of the highest concentrations of American military bases overseas. So one way to think about it is that about 1 in 8 U.S. service members who are stationed abroad are in Okinawa. So if we want to better understand the U.S. military presence abroad, what's been called an empire of bases with as many as 1,000 military bases around the world, Okinawa is a good place to start. So before I had ever visited Okinawa, I had heard about the local protest against these bases. And when I visited there, that's what I expected to encounter. And while there is a very strong resistance movement against these bases, which I'm going to talk about, I was surprised when I arrived there that a lot of people I met in Okinawa seemed to have more ambivalent feelings about the bases. And for them, the base issue was very complicated and tied up with a lot of very personal experiences and intimate issues. And it seemed a lot more complex than the rather simplistic pro-base or anti-base stories that I had heard before coming to Okinawa. And something about this ambivalence really resonated with me personally. In Okinawa, especially in the areas around the military bases, there's this mix of cultures and people because of the history of the island, because of the U.S. military presence. It's what academics may call a contact zone, which is a place where cultures, ideologies, and politics collide. And to me, as a mixed race person, that was something that felt familiar to me. And, I felt like I could understand why people had complex feelings, ambivalent feelings toward the U.S. military presence. And also, Okinawa felt like maybe not somewhere that I could belong, but somewhere that had more space for someone like me. So in writing this book, one of my goals was to tell a different kind of story about Okinawa, one I hadn't heard much before. In a lot of the stories I heard, Okinawans were cast as victims of the United States and Japan. But the people I met in Okinawa didn't seem to see themselves as victims. Instead, they were choosing to actively engage with the U.S. military presence in some way. They had agency, right? And with their actions, they could either help the bases remain or they could resist them, and in that threaten the stability of the entire U.S.-Japan security alliance. So in my research and reporting, I focused on women because they arguably are the most affected by the bases in Okinawa. They're the ones more likely to date and marry U.S. service members, to work in the entertainment areas around the bases, and to be the targets of sexual assault. So before I go into some of these women's stories, I want to just speak a little bit about the history of Okinawa. Maybe some of you know this already, but and there's much more in my book too if you're interested. So historically, as I said, Okinawa was separate from the rest of Japan. It was an independent kingdom called the Ryukyu Kingdom. And then in the late 1800s, Japan overthrew the king of the Ryukyus and annexed the islands as a prefecture. After that, Okinawans were pressured to assimilate and lose their traditional culture and language and become, Japanese. By the time World War II came along, many Okinawans did consider themselves Japanese, and that was an identity that was soon called into question during the war. On April 1st, 1945, the United States invaded this island here, and it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, with high casualties among American and Japanese troops. But the highest loss of life was among Okinawan civilians, with as many as 1 in 3 Okinawans dying in that battle. And some of the, for me at least, most horrifying and haunting stories from this battle, Japanese soldiers pressured or forced whole Okinawan families to take their own lives and those of their loved ones in these so-called group suicides. There were also accounts of Japanese soldiers killing Okinawans directly, taking their food, kicking them out of their hiding places. So, while Okinawans had come to consider themselves Japanese by this time, and they were willing to fight for Japan in this war, many soldiers in the Japanese military still saw Okinawans as the other and saw their lives as expendable. Okinawans who lived through that battle were shocked to find that the American soldiers who took them captive weren't the devil beasts that they had been told about. Instead of mass killing and torture, which they had heard about would happen, the American victors provided food, shelter, and medical aid to Okinawans. And so this was the start of Okinawans' complicated relationship with the American military presence. After World War II, the US occupied all of Japan, right, including Okinawa, but it stayed 20 years longer in Okinawa, occupying Okinawa until 1972. And it was during this time of the occupation that the US military closed a lot of bases on mainland Japan and built them in Okinawa, because in Okinawa they had total control, right? Okinawans call this process by bulldozer and bayonet because they often forced Okinawans from their land, at bayonet point or physically, and then bulldozed their homes to build these bases that are, some of which are still there today. Even when Okinawa became part of Japan again in 1972, those bases stayed, even though Okinawans are hoping that would mean the end of them. So, in this history, I was really interested in the tensions, so the kind of conflicting experiences and ideas related to the U.S. military presence. And so I'm going to read a little bit now from my book. So this is from a night in Okinawa when my friend, who was an American named Kate, said to me, "I want to take you to a place that's like an inside-out sock." And she led me through the entertainment district outside Kadena Air Base in Okinawa City.
What page? What page is that?
Page 31, if you want to follow along. Kate and I turned south from the main drag. As we entered a building on a side street, Kate said, "This is either the Okinawa in America or the America in Okinawa. Same thing, I guess." The sign on the door read reverse. She pushed it open, and inside, on a brightly lit stage, was a band in American 1950s costumes. They were either locals or from mainland Japan. The female singers wore poodle skirts and beehives, and the male crooners sported a silver suit and Elvis hair. I felt like I'd entered a David Lynch movie. The song "Can't Hurry Love" began, and a dozen middle-aged local women rushed to dance in front of the stage. A white man grooved at their center. The bar area was spotted with a few more grizzled Americans. "He's probably been here since the Vietnam War," Kate said, pointing at one of them. Sipping cocktails at the bar, we watched the dance floor fill after the band broke into La Bamba. When the Ritchie Valens hit had come out 50 years before, the island had been under American control. The 1950s and 60s, per the history books, were a time of Okinawan poverty, racial and sexual violence, and land seizure and protest. Life under American rule had been difficult for Okinawans. But here in reverse, the bar-goers swimming to Surfin' USA suggested a different kind of memory, a nostalgia for that time. It was Kate's inside-out sock, a story inverted to reveal a hidden, messier side. And so that wasn't the only kind of tribute to an America of the past that I saw on the island. I started noticing so many things like this are all around the island. So here's a few examples. So this was at a kind of little shopping center, and they had branded it in this kind of 1950s American drive-in imagery. This was outside a base, and someone had painted old American cars on benches there. This was a restaurant near the American Village owned by an Okinawan couple who just loved everything American, and they served really bad steak and pie and canned carrots and peas. This is in the American Village. Who here has been to the American Village? Okay, yeah, a few. So it's like a shopping center, but it's also kind of like a Disneyland USA. And you can see that here's a store there. They have a fake Statue of Liberty there. And in this store, you can buy all this US military branded gear. And there are old US military posters on the wall. There's Uncle Sam. You can buy old TV guides there and Life magazine. And this is a scene from the American Village. You can see it's probably an American military family. There's old American license plates there, and then some Okinawan kids probably hanging out there. So again, in all of this, I was interested in these kinds of tensions, so that difficult history and protest alongside this kind of intimacy with America and what you might even call a celebration of America. These kinds of tensions were what I was interested in exploring with the women who I spoke to as well. My book is organized around 10 women who I profile, one in each chapter, and I'm going to read the opening of one of them now called Arisa. When Arisa was a girl in the 1980s, her father devised an unusual game. He challenged her and her sister to walk all the way around Kadena Air Base with him. The family lived in Okinawa City, close enough to the base that the Japanese government paid for double-paned windows and an air conditioning unit in each room to muffle the noise of the aircraft. In her father's game, the three of them would set out from their house and begin walking along the tall fence topped with barbed wire. I think my dad wanted us to know how big Kadena Base is, Arisa said. Kadena is the biggest U.S. Air Force base in all of Asia, swallowing chunks of Chatan Town, Kadena Town, and Okinawa City. Its 2 runways stretched more than 2 miles each. When Antibase demonstrators joined hands in protests around the base in 1986, forming a human chain, they needed more than 20,000 bodies. Arisa, her father, and her sister would start at the northeast end of the base, following the fence south through the entertainment district of bars and clubs. They'd break for lunch at an A&W, then rest again at McDonald's after reaching Route 58 in Chatan. They'd continue north into the town of Kadena, where residents received even higher subsidies from the Japanese government since they were closer to the runways. After 4 or 5 hours, the circle would be complete, and Arisa's father would reward his daughters with 10,000 yen bills, a considerable prize for a kid. Arisa's parents were both busy professionals, her father an engineer, her mother an elementary school teacher. Although they didn't discuss their political views of the bases, Arisa knew her mother voted for anti-base candidates and sometimes protested outside the bases as part of a teachers' organization. The prevailing attitude at Arisa's school, too, was against the bases. Perhaps with his game, her dad was trying to engender some sense of injustice in his daughters, showing them viscerally how much land Kadena Base occupied. The impression on Arisa in any case was positive. She would remember those walks with fondness, not only because of the cash she earned, but also because of the adventure and the way they had etched the base into her imagination. So I love this story of these little Okinawan girls who played this game of walking around this giant military base right here. They were literally growing up in the shadows of this base, and their parents were politically against the US military presence, but this was a fun game for Arisa, one that she remembered positively. And Arisa went on to marry a US serviceman and have kids with him, and she became someone who no longer had to circle this base, but could actually cross the fence line and go on the base, which is something, most Americans who are not connected to the military can't do. Arisa told me she was happy about her life choices, but she felt some internal tension about the base issue. She said that she felt like her spirit was Okinawan, and she believed there needed to be a reduction of US bases in Okinawa, but she felt like she could never get involved in the anti-base movement because her husband worked on base. And now her parents too, who used to protest the bases, felt more ambivalent. I found that for a lot of women, the US military presence had some effect on their identity. And it was surprising to me that a lot of women were using the military presence in a positive way for them. And so they were using these kind of American spaces that were created to express parts of themselves that they felt like they couldn't otherwise in Japanese and Okinawan society. And this was especially true when it came to escaping traditional Japanese gender roles. Some Okinawan women told me they preferred working on base because they felt like men and women were treated more as equals there. They said it was a more relaxed environment compared to Japanese workplaces. Maybe you heard in the news recently, there's been a lot about how Japanese employers force their women sometimes to, wear high heels or ban them from wearing glasses. So that, the women I met said that wasn't going on base, and so they liked that better. Some women told me that they prefer dating American men. And there's a especially large group in Okinawa of women who prefer to only date African American men. There's even a word for that kind of subculture of women. And there's a lot more in the book, but I looked a lot into this, kind of asking, where is this coming from? And I think a lot of it did seem superficial or problematic and maybe rooted in racist stereotypes, but also women told me that something deeper was going on as well. Some people told me they felt especially connected to American service members of color because of a shared experience of facing discrimination from the dominant population. So, in the case of Okinawans, from Japanese people, in the case of the service members, from white Americans. There's an Okinawan photographer named Mao Ishikawa, and she documented relationships like this just after the Vietnam War in the 1970s in Okinawa, when Mao worked in a base town bar that was also a Black Panther hangout. And these are few of her photos from that time. So I talked to Mao, and she said that when she was working at that bar, she found that she felt more comfortable with Black men than with Okinawan men. And she thought the men treated her more like their equal. And later she realized that the bond was about their shared struggles. I'm going to read a little bit more about Mao, on page 157. Mao had started out wanting to photograph American soldiers, but realized the Okinawan women working in the bars were more interesting. On a small island that could feel socially claustrophobic, these women managed to be free-spirited, uninhibited. They didn't care when prejudiced family and friends judged them for hanging out with, dating, loving Black men. The women enjoyed their lives, enjoyed their bodies, enjoyed sex unapologetically. In this, Mao recognized a more extreme version of herself, and she felt overwhelmed by their way of life. To her, these women were like akebana, the beautiful red flower that grows everywhere on Okinawa, the one you picked if you didn't have money to buy a bouquet when you visited a grave. She decided to follow their example, care even less what others thought. There are those who look down on women who work at military bars, she writes. They assume that the women are prostitutes. That is a total misconception. The bar girls were living their lives to the fullest. So again, this was, example of Okinawan women who were using this U.S. military presence to express themselves in a way they felt like they couldn't otherwise. But of course, while many Okinawans are choosing to interact with the U.S. military presence, there are many others who are fighting to close the bases. And this is me with an activist who I profile in my book. Her name is Suzuyo Takazato. And one of the things that she's doing is leading an effort to document all cases of U.S. military violence against women since the end of World War II. And her group's research shows very vividly that sexual assault by U.S. service members has long been a problem in Okinawa, especially during those occupation years when Okinawans lacked rights and soldiers who committed rape usually faced no legal consequences. They more often face legal consequences now for sexual assault, but the issue has definitely continued. Maybe you've heard about some of the high-profile incidents that have happened in Okinawa, like the 1995 rape of a 12-year-old girl, or more recently, as I write about in my book, there was a murder of a 20-year-old woman in 2016 in Okinawa by an American ex-Marine. And incidents like these are definitely just the tip of the iceberg, with many, many more going unreported, and they spark, widespread protests against the military when they are exposed. And I can talk more about that later if people are interested. So other reasons people protest the U.S. military include noise pollution, those planes taking off over these neighborhoods, environmental degradation, and military and traffic accidents. This is Marine Corps Air Station Futenma, which maybe you've heard about. It's been called the most dangerous base in the world, and I think you can see why, right? There's this busy flight line in the middle of a densely packed city. The city has the density of Chicago, and there's an air base right in the middle of it. And there have been accidents. A helicopter crashed on a university bordering the base, and luckily nobody was killed. More recently, a piece of a helicopter fell on an elementary school outside the base, missing the nearest child by just 15 feet. So pretty much everyone agrees this base needs to close. And the US and Japan have said they will since 1996, but it's still there. And they said they'll close it if they can build another base on Okinawa in a less populated area of the island, in the north of the island. And so this is the location of the new base that they're trying to build. It's called Ora Bay, right here. And I'm gonna read one final section of the book from the chapter called Chie, on page 219. On a bay as flat and gray as the sky, Chie Miyagi paddled out to confront the United States and Japan. It was a cold February morning in 2017, 8 years after Chie had taken me into a cave where schoolgirls like her mother, Sachiko, had toiled as nurses during the war. Now 58 years old, Chie was still a local high school English teacher and peace activist, known for her extroversion, individuality, and collection of rainbow outfits and fake flowers she tucked into her hair. Her English nickname was Sunshine. On Ora Bay, her highlighter pink jacket and neon orange kayak were bursts of color, while the other 8 kayakers with her were dressed in black. All 9 had concealed their faces with hats, sunglasses, and bandanas. Together, they represented a range of ages and backgrounds, those who were young and those who were retired, those who were Okinawan and those who were from mainland Japan. We were born in different places and we have different jobs, Chie said, but our goal is one: we will protect Ora Bay. The group was called Henoko Blue, and they did this regularly, paddling to where the new mammoth U.S. military base was being built in a district of Nago called Henoko on the eastern coast. The construction site was the bay, which was, for the moment at least, gorgeous and biologically diverse, home to coral reef ecosystems and the endangered Okinawa dugong, a revered manatee-like creature that grazed on rare seagrass. The U.S. military wanted to fill in the bay with 21 million cubic meters of rock, sand, and gravel and build a double runway, state-of-the-art behemoth. The landfill work had resumed recently after a hiatus, with a crew drilling for survey work and dropping concrete blocks into the water. Henoko's Blues mission for the day was to stop or slow any scheduled construction. Chie's larger mission was to end the U.S. military presence in Okinawa. She, like the other kayakers, was willing to risk her life to achieve it. So here's Chie that day that I went out with them onto the bay, and there's some other kayakers. They told me that the Japanese Coast Guard, who's patrolling this area, often gets violent with them, so has flipped over their kayaks, choked them, held their faces in the water, and so that some of them actually felt like they were going to die. But they, feel so passionately about this cause that they still go out there, some of them every day, some of them every week. And they're just a few of the many Okinawans who are outside this construction zone every day. Most are on land, so this is outside one of the gates to the base. There have been people who have been holding a sit-in there for years, and most of them are elderly. Their goal is to stop the construction trucks from coming onto base with that sand and gravel they're going to dump into the bay. And many of them, lived through the Battle of Okinawa, and like this gentleman told me, his brother died in that battle, and he was injured, and that's why he feels so passionately about demilitarizing his island and not being part of that. So they're out there. They try to block cars from leaving base is one of the things they do. And then, hired security comes out and removes them every few minutes. And some people have been injured this way. This situation is still going on, as some of you may know. So people are still out there, still protesting this base. The majority of Okinawans have expressed that they do not want this new base built. They voted that way. They elected an Antibase governor. But the federal government of Japan is still moving forward with this base construction and ignoring their will. And they've started dumping that sand and gravel into the bay. But this last photo to me, shows the complexity of the situation as well. This woman in the green jacket was a protester there that day, and she stopped for a minute from protesting to talk to her friend who was an Okinawan who worked on the base. So, she knows she's out there trying to close the base, but she knows that if she's successful, her friend and other Okinawans will lose their jobs. And to me, this photo also represents that, there are these tall fences topped with barbed wire around the bases, and it seems like two very distinct places on and off base. But like all borders, they're porous, and there's a constant exchange of people and cultures and ideas moving on and off base. And it's a much more complicated story than it might seem at first. So thank you.
So thank you very much for joining us today. It's always a lot of fun. I got to meet Akemi when we were both on the Fulbright Fellowship together, and since that time we've talked a lot about the research and the complexities of this. And so, in fact, last fall quarter, just this last quarter, I was able to use her book in one of my classes, and I think the reception was really good because it was a class focused on Asian American women. And so I think I just have a couple of questions for you when we talk today. And I think too, I know that really, of course, it's so important to center women, but I think what else were you able to garner? I mean, since you said for women, they're the ones that are the most affected by work, marriage, and assault and things like that. But besides sort of the obvious of what we could garner from that, what else? What other insights did a lot of these women give you that really helped shape the narrative? Because again, too, we recognize, and I recognize too, not being Okinawan, your outsider status, right? And so kind of what did that generate for you, I guess?
Yeah, I think another reason I wanted to center women is that I think, at least in the West, I think we hear if we hear about, Asian women around U.S. military bases abroad, it's usually a certain kind of story, right? Me love you, long time sex worker, Madam Butterfly, and, these geisha girl, all of these really destructive racist stereotypes, right? So I wanted to, put women at the center of this and show real women's stories, and that are really nothing like those caricatures that we might have heard about in the U.S. And then, you know, it's also that I really wanted to move beyond the victim story as well, even though that is really important, the story of sexual assault, and it's a giant problem that we cannot overlook and people need to know about more. But at the same time, you know, there are many women who are, as I said, like seeking out the U.S. military presence and taking something from it. So they're using the situation to get something that they want, and for a lot of times that was expressing themselves in this kind of more American way, being more like outspoken, caring less what others thought about them, maybe dressing how they wanted to dress, and all of that. So that was surprising to me, and so I wanted to kind of just, you know, show these other types of stories that we might not have heard about.
And then would you say that since a lot of them become activists kind of in various ways, do you think that there's some kind of indication of maybe like a Me Too movement kind of, you know, growing in that way, even if it's obviously, it's not an American Me Too movement, but is there anything like that you notice, like as far as empowerment and things like that?
I saw that the Me Too type movement is really struggling in Japan and Okinawa, and there wasn't one activist who I met who was working, you know, to close the bases and speaking out about sexual assault, and she told me she had gotten involved in this because her friend had been gang raped by American soldiers in high school, and actually my last trip to Okinawa, I found out that actually that had been her, and you know, but it's something that she doesn't speak about, and you know, I totally understand why, but I think a lot of people have not felt like they could come forward and talk about their experiences with sexual assault in Japan and in Okinawa to a higher degree than in the U.S. I think it's like something like 4% or less than 4% of rapes are reported to the police in Japan, or in the U.S. it's something like a third. And some U.S. service members have admitted that knowing these statistics led them to commit sexual assault in Okinawa because they felt like they could get away with it. So I think there's a really long way to go in Japan and Okinawa with creating an environment and empowering women to share their stories, report their stories to the police so that we know about it. Because as that activist Suzuyo Takazato said, that if we knew about all the instances of sexual assault that happened in Okinawa, how could the bases survive in that case? Because it would be like an avalanche of stories.
Plus too, they're not just fighting sexual assault between like gender, it's the American government, it's the Japanese government kind of doing what they wish, even though they have an anti-base governor and many of the people are not for the base. But again, it's so complicated, so what do you do? Yeah, I don't know. What, I guess too, as we think about this, because for some folks that are here as students, perhaps some of my students are in the audience, when you think about like going and like, I guess we should have started with this question, but like why, I guess for your research, what were some of the challenges you faced, and like what, of course we kind of know the whys of why you decided to do this, but what are some of the challenges you could share kind of as a like intimate, well, as intimate as it can be in that
Behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, yeah. Some of that.
Yeah.
You can share that.
I mean, this took me, I started working on some form of this project in college, so like over 15 years ago. And so it was a really long time I was working on this. And I think I realized that I needed that time to understand the situation because it's very complicated and I'm a total outsider and I wanted to get it right. And I think one of the biggest challenges was just understanding all the complexity and learning about it. And, you know, I think the first time I went to Okinawa, I didn't even realize how it was such a different place than the rest of Japan. I thought, oh, I'm just in like another part of Japan. But people there talk about Japan like it's a totally different place. They're like, oh, in Japan, like over there, you know? And so I had to kind of relearn what is Okinawa, what does it mean to all these different people. And I think actually at times my status as an outsider helped because people I think could feel like they could open up to me more. In a lot of cases, I wasn't part of their community and maybe they felt more comfortable.
Did your mixed race like background, did that also help you? Like in what way did it help you, would you say?
Yeah. Well, I want to share a story about you.
I
I remember once we went out, Lily had just arrived in Okinawa, we went out to like one of these bar areas outside of a military base for research, of course. And like these servicemen came up and said like, konnichiwa or something, to Lily, and you said like...
I was like thrilled, because so I don't get to pass very much as Asian, because I'm also mixed race, and I speak Japanese as my first language, and so I passed, and I was thrown off, because I was like, whoa, like, how did that, like, usually I get spoken to in Spanish, so that's my, like, space, and so this was really, like, such a different world, so I was thrown off. So then, like, we went with it, like, we were like, okay, cool, yeah, let's get into this role then, like.
Yeah, so I think that's great, because I could kind of be in different spaces, and people assumed I belonged there, even though they assumed like I was part of the other group, So I think the service members assumed I was Okinawan, and Okinawans assumed I was with the U.S. military, and so I could kind of go wherever I wanted to and not really be noticed, and just like take it all in, and observe what's going on.
Kind of like a spy.
Yeah.
Well, no, because then too, a lot of the Japanese like offices would say, well, if you're filling out paperwork, they would say, well, no military can be here. And I was like, I'm not in the military. And then it's like, then why are you here? So it was very odd to be racialized in that kind of way. So, but yeah, that was a lot of fun to go undercover. I think as we, especially this is just so we work good on time, thinking about the bases, right? What would you think would happen, like as we relocating the base, what would that mean for Okinawans and Okinawan women, especially since some are so pro and con, and like you're, in that last picture you showed us of people looking at each other through the base and in this very porous militarized borderland, like what would this be for the future if we could
close all the bases,
right, or close some, or how this would, what would this really look like? What would you think? I mean, I'm asking you to tell the future, so sorry.
Yeah. I totally support, what Okinawan people want, and I think they have shown at the ballots that they want a reduction of bases. And so I think that should happen. But I think just living there, I also realized that, something would be lost as well. And especially for these interracial families, international families who live there. There are many families. There are many service members who, meet someone there, fall in love, get married, have kids, and stay forever in Okinawa, and Okinawa becomes their home. And there's one family I got close to is in the book. And, for them, Okinawa is like this perfect blend of America, Japan, Okinawa, and they can live on and off base, and it's just perfectly their world, right? And so all of that would be gone, which I think, is something that needs to happen, but it is a unique space that certain people really thrive in, and there's more of those people than you might imagine, especially mixed race people. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Renee Liu. I was born and raised in Okinawa, born on the Army base, Camp Kauai. So my father worked for FBIS, which is a foreign broadcasting information service, so we live on Kadena. So I went back to Okinawa after I left at 18, and then I went back from college for like summer. So living on base, being a civilian, but having access to Kadena, I left in 77, but there were strikes going on against the base by Zengunro. And I recently have been keeping up with China's influence in sending over many protesters to kind of integrate into that protest against the base. Have you encountered any of that talking to people there?
Yeah, I'm just curious, where did you learn about that, or where did you hear about that?
I'm a writer, and living in Okinawa, and my father working there, I just keep abreast of Okinawa because I feel that that's my home.
Yeah.
I'm Chinese by birth. My parents are Chinese, but most people who have service people that have gone and stationed in Okinawa have a really fond relationship with it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was wondering if you encountered any of that whether it's hearsay or whether it's factual from your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did hear that a lot when I was on the base, from Americans and from Okinawans working on the base that said, those protesters outside the base, they're not Okinawan. Okinawans people would not do that. Okinawans are friendly. They love everyone. They don't protest. And, Okinawans are very friendly people, but they also do protest. I heard that the protesters are paid by China. They're sent over from China or Korea, and I just didn't find that was the case. I can't say that that's not happening, but I went and hung out with them. I got to know some of them pretty well, and they were Okinawan people who felt very passionately about the Antibase movement, and for a lot of different reasons, including the legacy of the battle and wanting peace, wanting to do nothing with the U.S. military, not wanting to destroy the natural environment and all those things. So I don't know, it could happen, but I did not find evidence of that going on. But I did, a lot of people did believe that, especially on base. Yeah.
Hi, you said that you wanted to profile different stories and maybe other stories we would hear about Japanese women around American bases. Before going in and doing your research, did you have any ideas of stories that you might hear or preconceived notions? And then were there any stories that you might have wanted to profile but didn't in your book?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's a great question. So before going in, like I said, I definitely had heard the stories about sexual assaults, and so I knew that was something I wanted to cover. It was very hard, understandably, to get someone to share their personal story of that. So I really focused on the activist who's really working to address that issue in the book. And then you said the second part, what didn't make it in the book about women's stories. My earlier version of the book was all about this one woman who I thought was so interesting. And then she said she didn't want to be in the book anymore, and I had to take it all out. But she was this great character, and she was from Tokyo, but she had started a group in Okinawa to help women who are dating American servicemen, because she thought that there was a need for for help, basically, because a lot of family and friends could be judgmental if you're dating an American. Like it's your own fault if you have any problems, that kind of mentality. And so she really didn't have any background in this, but she would just kind of go out and help women really in kind of unorthodox ways, just giving them advice. And I thought it was so interesting. But yeah, to take all of that out of the book.
My question was kind of a follow-up to that. I was kind of curious about a few things. One, how did you pick those 8 women? I haven't read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But also, how did you garner their trust? And there's some language issues, right? And I was wondering, did it help that it actually took you 15 years to kind of dig deeper and kind of uncover the truth of what these women's stories?
Yeah, it definitely, the time helps. It hurts you too in some ways. So I really wanted to show a range of experiences in my book. So I kind of set out to find women in represent different categories, someone who was married to an American, someone who's dating Americans. So I really wanted a Filipino woman who worked in the bar areas, because I had heard a lot about that these women are all trafficked, and that they have, these really tragic stories. And I really wanted to talk to someone and really find out what is her actual story. And so I have a Filipino woman in there who came to Okinawa to work in the bars, and mixed race person, and someone who works on the base, and so to represent all these different experiences. So I think did take a long time to find the right person for each of those groups, and like you said, to earn their trust. I think it really helped that I could live there for a year at one time and get to know people, and then be introduced to other people, as you experienced too, right? That's really important, forging the relationships. And that really takes time. And then the language issue, I mean, luckily, I think in Okinawa, especially the people I was talking to, a lot of them spoke pretty good English because they're connected to the base in some way. And so their English was really better than my Japanese. I think Lily interpreted for me a couple of times. She was really nice. Sometimes I had someone help with that. And then I had studied some Japanese, so I could kind of understand somewhat. Yeah.
My grandparents came from Okinawa, and I came here late, so I'm not sure if you pointed out the fact that the United States does not pay rent for the use of the land, but the nation of Japan pays them to stay there, and it pays the wages of the civilians who work there. And but anyway, I wanted to thank you for writing this book because I think it adds so much to the history. Also, the statement you have in one of the last chapters, whereby a government official told someone from Okinawa that the bases should stay there because the are used to them. That tells a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah, so what he mentioned, I think a lot of people don't realize, is that Japan really pays for these bases, U.S. bases in Okinawa. And so, this is like what people call a really dual colonial situation. It's not just the U.S. who's wanting the bases in Okinawa, Japan wants them there. And so it's not only up to the U.S. to move them, but it's also Japan. I mean, why would the U.S. want to move bases if Japan's saying, we'll pay for these if you have them here?
I mean, it's even, oops, sorry, I turned it off. What surprised me, and I know that this is like the rent for the base is one thing, but like they're also paying for things like the electrical bills in the military housing. And I know folks have been in the military, like what they're doing is a tremendous job for the country. So I don't mean to minimize that. But what was really surprising to me, having lived there for the summer without air conditioning, because I lived with Okinawans and they were like, we don't turn on the AC, we open the windows and let the trade wind go through. And meanwhile, I was just in a personal sweat shower. And eventually you do get used to it. I mean, I did get, pretty used to it, and, until for the most part. But there were people on the base that I got to meet who said, oh yeah, we have the AC cranked up to 60 whatever. And we use our down comforters. And I was like, why would you use a down comforter? It's like 4,000 degrees outside. And then it occurred to me, they're like, well, it's just part of the housing. And I was like, oh, okay, that's being paid, so then it's to that degree of like, they're paying for all of these things, not to say that the comfort of the military is not important, but that's all part of that, as well.
Yeah, it was icy cold on base.
Yeah, most of the buildings, I mean, you need a blanket almost, like those cold corporate type of buildings where the AC is just cranked up. Yeah, and in the middle of the summer, and then you go outside and then you're in an oven, and then sweating.
I want to thank you both. That was a really great presentation for me. It really kind of hits close to home because my dad was actually in the Air Force, and so I grew up on Kadena Air Base from 3rd grade through high school. And so there is this fondness that I do have. I actually call it my hometown. And I think it is very complicated. I think there's so many Okinawans that are really close to me, and that kind of blend of cultures. We would open the base on 4th of July, and that's actually something we all looked forward to have all the locals come on and just have that interaction. And then 9/11 happened, and I was there, and then all of a sudden it was a big turn, and we had to, obviously there was a lot of security, we had to stop those events. But at the same time, I'm familiar with Gate 2 Street, where there's a bunch of bars, and I remember always driving down that with my parents. And it's very, there would be billboards of women in bikinis, and as a child, you're like, oh, that's interesting. Why do they paint women that way? And I had asked my parents, what's going on inside there? So it's just nighttime entertainment. But I would always wonder, as I grew older, and there were actually things really close that I knew people that were kind of in those places. I always hope that
they were being treated well inside there. And one of the things, growing up on the base, you would take the classes, Japanese classes, to learn the culture. I felt that my class and the generation I grew up with, who all grew up on Okinawa, we have so much respect for it. And I just hope that that kind of translated to our parents who were in the military, that the military took steps to kind of change the culture. Because a lot of it is if you're promoting Gate 2 Street as, hey, all the airmen go out there and have fun, well, that's where it's leading to these problems. I think you probably started your research right after I left, so I'm curious, did you notice any of those cultural changes? Were the Americans any more different when you went out to do your field work? But isn't looking at your expressions.
Well, I think it's really hard to, group all the U.S. service members there together because you really can't. And there are so many who are so respectful of the local culture and really love the local culture. And like I said, men who never leave, like they get there like, this is it, I'm never leaving. And they learn Japanese and they become like super Okinawan and, so there are a ton of really good examples, and I think the tricky part is like, well, does that make up for the smaller group who's causing a lot of problems on the island, right? And I think a lot of people would say no. That's great that they're good neighbors, but there are also people committing a lot of crimes, and there are 18,000 Marines in Okinawa. A lot of them are 18 years old, first time away from home. Going out drinking and heavily and, stuff happens, right? And so it's, like you said, it's very complicated. But I definitely think there are a lot of people who are really living very peacefully and respectfully in Okinawa and really loving it there too.
I just remember thinking, going to Gate 2 Street with Akemi, we were trying to blend in and going, and I remember that she had said like, oh, we're not allowed even into some of these bars because women are actually not part of the people who are supposed to go watch other women's dance and strip, right? So that was kind of shocking to me that we could be excluded in that kind of way, even if we pretend past, as local, but still we were just, I thought that was really interesting. And there was like that madame lady that was watching us, did not let us in at all. So we were just we're like walking in the red light district, just kind of like, I don't know, it was kind of an interesting time, so yeah. But no, it is something that I think those of us that are familiar with Okinawa get that, how vivid that is, and then, so.
But in terms of what the military is doing, they have tried to improve their cultural sensitivity training that they give to newly arrived service members, and because it was kind of exposed as being very problematic, and so they have made improvements to that. So I think they definitely are trying.
I had a question about the book, the reception with the local Uchinanshu. What did they think about your book, and then what's any follow-up to it? I mean, did it open any doors or any other discussions or groups?
So I just got to go to Okinawa in December, and it was interesting because my event there was mostly U.S. military people, and I think partly because it's in English, only in English right now. So I think it's a lot of Okinawan people maybe haven't read it yet. In Okinawa, it is coming out in Japanese later this year. So I think at that point I'll probably hear more from Okinawan people. So I think mostly at this point in Okinawa, I've heard from the U.S. military community readers who say thank you because we can understand Okinawa better. And so I'm really happy about that. I think I don't want to tell Okinawans about their own history, but then again, I did hear that a lot of people in Okinawans don't learn about their own history because it's not taught in schools. It's a national curriculum, so it's they learn the same thing as kids in Tokyo, so they're not learning much about the recent history of Okinawa or older history. So I'm really interested to hear more of what Okinawan people think, and I think when it comes out in Japanese, I'll be able to get a better idea of the response.
Hello, thank you for coming all the way over here. So I think your book is really, really interesting. I haven't been able to read it, but what I've heard. My question is about, so the anti-base movement. And what you were saying is how like the U.S. and Japan want these bases here. Is that connected to a larger sort of nationalist movement for Okinawa, since they are sort of a different people from, well, they are different people from the Japanese and they share a different history, or did you still see a sort of pride in being Japanese and being connected to that greater national culture?
In Okinawa.
In Okinawa, yeah.
I think, you know, why are the bases in Okinawa? I think it's definitely because of Okinawa's, you know, outsider status in Japan and being a separate people. I think they're, you know, a minority group within Japan, and nobody wants a military base in their backyard, right? So if you can put it somewhere far away for the people who have more political power, you're going to do that. And again, because of the history of the U.S. Occupied Okinawa for 20 years longer, that's when they could build all those bases there in Okinawa. And then your second part, you know, where are Okinawa people today? I think there has been a resurgence of Okinawan pride, you know, in Okinawa, and, you know, identifying as Okinawan, trying to bring back the dying languages, and, you know, celebrate being Okinawan. There's even like a very small independence movement trying to make Okinawa independent again from the rest of Japan. But then again, I think there are other people in Okinawa who would just consider themselves Japanese, maybe first before Okinawan. Yeah.
Isn't culturally Okinawans are like, it's just a mixed bag, but Chinese, it's just their influence is Chinese and all that. So I don't know, just researching for me, the struggle, strategically I grew up during the Vietnam War there. So living on Kadena, the base, South Command, was just right in my backyard, and all the planes would fly over. Okinawa is very strategically placed for Japan and the United States. So this relationship is really interesting because it is like a wonderful strategic place in the East China Sea. So I mean, it just seems like it would be difficult to leave one or the other, and then you have China wanting to take over a lot of the islands over there. So it seems like such a paradox at this point, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely
for everybody involved.
strategic. Yeah, you can see on the map, right? It's a central location, and so you know, people want that real estate, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people want to control that area. Yeah.
Okay, I think this will be our last question.
And she had a comment.
She had a comment
one
too.
more.
That's okay, you can go first.
One comment real quick, just to go back to the Chinese thing. I know that when the riot police came over from mainland, one of the slurs that they used against the Okinawan people was that they were Chinese, and so there's a long history, I think, of Japanese superiority against Chinese people, and so that's built into sort of all of this, and potentially why it connected to some of those sort of things being said on base, I think, is that, you know, if we can see them as Chinese, then we just can, you know, create this other layer of racism. My question, visiting Okinawa recently, it seems like there's sort of a shift in, like, economically the base, they're less and less dependent on the base, and I think what's taking the place is tourism, and tourism is really becoming the weight of the land is taking on tourism, and right now that's really coming from Japanese and Chinese tourists and not Americans, and so it's a little bit of a different stream. It's interesting. In Tokyo, everything's made for English tourists, but when you're in Okinawa, tourism places, it's not for English speakers, you know, and so I'm just curious, in your interviews with women and doing the project, sort of what role tourism started to play in people's minds and worlds.
Well, I think like in some of those images I showed of American stuff, I think a lot of that is kind of tourist stuff. And although like Americans and Okinawans do hang out in those spaces too, but a lot of it is like geared even toward Chinese tourists, or like they come here and it's like, oh, it's like a little America. And so I think that's kind of interesting, right? And like you said, that there's a shift now, I think, with businesses. They're learning Chinese now. They're trying to get Chinese menus and not English. And so they're moving away from catering to the U.S. military to tourists and seeing that as a, you know, maybe a more lucrative market for them. So, as that grows, I think it might, people told me this, professors told me this, they think as kind of Okinawans could gain more confidence in that as a revenue stream, that they'll feel more comfortable advocating for the bases to close, and feel like they don't need them economically.
But then tourism is so risky because you're relying on people to have to come, and environmentally, what does that mean, especially with ecotourism too? And I think one of the things, since you mentioned tourism, one of the things that Okinawa projects for part of like the Okinawan flair is of course like goya champuru and all these wonderful dishes that are quintessentially Okinawan, but like they're peppered with American flavors, right? Spam is in that dish. And then even like the more recent one, tacos rice, which is, I don't know if you guys know what tacos rice is, but it's Japanese white rice. It's like a donburi, Japanese white rice, and on top it's Mexican like taco meat, like with like the powdered taco sauce, not legit like tacos that we in California would eat, but like old El Paso taco in the little envelope in ground beef, and that's on the rice. And then on top of that is like cheese and lettuce. So it's kind of like a deconstructed taco on top of Japanese white rice, and it's called tacos rice because that's the military wanted Mexican food, and this is what they got. And then this became an Okinawan thing, and so now you can get tacos rice kits at the airport on your way in and out. So what they're going to sell is going to be this really interesting hybridized American Japanese kind of space and Okinawan cultural space, which is to me like what,
Yeah. And it's like being packaged for Chinese tourists.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, but it's good. I mean, I ate it. You ate it.
I like it.
No, I'm not knocking it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Deborah. I messaged you on Facebook. So I really recommend this book. I had to read it. I chose it for a Women in U.S. History class last semester. So the reason why I chose it was because I'm half Okinawan. I'm from Hawaii. I lived in Okinawa from 1963 to 71, so it was kind of the height of the Vietnam War. My father worked for the Army, and so I went to school there, basically on Air Force bases. So whenever planes flew, class stopped and everything. But I think your book is great. It really is. Historically, it's a page turner. I mean, I read the book so fast, and then the clincher was we had to write a paper, compare to what we had learned about women in U.S. history. But I think for me, the disturbing part is, and because I was a former journalist, the things we don't talk about, right? The racism, kids who are half Okinawan or whatever they go through, the base, the guys that are, 18 years old. And I think that was disturbing for me to realize, like the three guys who supposedly raped this young lady, they knew they could get away with it just because of the behavior. They're being trained for military, war. And I think as a woman, it just kind of made me feel like, it's so dehumanizing. You leave somebody in a field. I mean, it just stirred up all these emotions. And I think too, when you mentioned like World War II and about the nurses, right? And I thought about my grandparents who immigrated to Hawaii. I mean, when I grew up there, it wasn't like the pictures you show now because it's totally different. You can Google everything and you can kind of bypass it. But I grew up there at a time where, building relationships, it was a challenge. I mean, when I was in school there too, we had things like, you can be in choir, but you can be in the Okinawan choir. And, out of school of maybe 200, 300 kids, there was only like 25 of us who wanted to sing in that choir or learn. But it's kind of nice to know that, we're bridging the gap. Time has passed and there's better relations. But I think also the fact too, like where they're strategically located. I mean, come on, we hear on the news now about North Korea, right? I mean, I don't think they're going to close the military bases, and I watch a lot of NHK every day, and you see the reports, and it's just like love-hate relationship, or we need each other. But really, if you want to read a good book, this is a good book to read. Because you'll find out. I think for myself too, I really didn't know about Okinawa, I mean, I lived there as a kid. I mean, I didn't know the history, and then when I was reading the history, it was just like shocking. You know, and I had this book at home from my parents, you know, the Battle of Okinawa. It used to be like, really? And now I think because I read your book, it's like, okay, I want to go back and read that book too, but it's more updated. You know, so thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I think that's a really great place to kind of end on. I want to thank both of you so much again for being here. If you could